It all started in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everything looked picture-perfect on the surface. The lawns were trimmed with ruler-like precision. The houses stood in neat rows painted in muted shades of beige and gray, and every driveway was free from so much as a stray leaf. But beneath that perfect veneer lurked something far more suffocating: the power of the homeowners association. For years, they had ruled over every detail of the community, from the length of the grass to the color of the shutters, making sure no resident dared to step outside their narrow definition of acceptable. For one homeowner, this rigid system of control was tolerable, until it wasn't. He had always been the type to quietly follow the rules, pay his dues, and avoid confrontation. That was until he placed a small American flag in front of his house. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a modest flagpole anchored near the porch with the stars and stripes fluttering gently in the breeze. To him, it was a symbol of pride, heritage, and respect for those who had fought for freedom. To anyone else passing by, it was nothing more than a harmless decoration. But to the HOA, it was a violation. The letter arrived on a warm afternoon, folded neatly in an envelope stamped with the HOA's logo. It was curt, sterile, and absolute. The message demanded that the flag be removed immediately, citing a clause buried deep within the association's bylaws. No exterior displays of personal or national symbols without prior approval. The words stung, not because of their tone, but because of the hypocrisy they carried. Just down the street, several homes displayed seasonal wreaths, sports team banners, and decorative garden ornaments, none of which had ever been questioned. At first, he tried to reason with himself. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe someone on the board had confused his display with something else. But the more he thought about it, the more a different reality settled in. This wasn't about the flag being inappropriate. This was about control. The HOA had seen an opportunity to flex its authority, and they had chosen him as the target. As the sun dipped lower that evening, he stood on his porch and watched the flag ripple in the fading light. It wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't out of place. And yet by tomorrow, it was supposed to be gone. The thought gnawed at him, stirring a quiet anger that grew with each passing hour. Over the next few days, he began to notice subtle changes in the way his neighbors acted around him. Some avoided eye contact, crossing the street instead of walking past his house. Others gave polite but nervous nods, as though they wanted to show support but feared being seen doing so. A few whispered rumors trickled through the grapevine, things like, "He's in trouble with the board," and "They're going to fine him if he doesn't comply." The social pressure was mounting, and the HOA was counting on that pressure to force his hand. But what they didn't know was that this man wasn't going to cave. The more they pushed, the more determined he became to resist. What began as a quiet act of patriotism was now transforming into something larger, a stand against the suffocating grip of the association that dictated every corner of life in the neighborhood. That night, long after the streets had fallen silent and the porch lights flickered out, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by notes, sketches, and measurements. His mind raced with ideas, each one bolder than the last. If the HOA wanted the flag gone, then perhaps he should give them more flag than they could ever imagine. Not a single banner, not a small decoration, but something so massive, so undeniable, that it would turn their attempt at control into a humiliating defeat. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, his plan was already taking shape. Supplies would need to be ordered, permits would need to be researched, and most importantly, the execution would need to be flawless. The HOA was notorious for finding loopholes and technicalities to force compliance, but he was prepared to play their game to the letter of the law. In his heart, the decision had been made. The flag wasn't coming down. In fact, it was about to become bigger than ever before. As the morning light illuminated the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the uniform houses and pristine lawns, a quiet determination settled in. The HOA thought they had won by sending their letter. What they didn't realize was that they had just ignited a battle, one that would soon turn the entire neighborhood into a spectacle the likes of which they had never seen before. And this was only the beginning. The plan began in silence, with nothing more than quiet deliveries arriving at odd hours and the occasional stranger measuring sections of the property. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like he was preparing for home repairs or maybe an elaborate renovation. But beneath the surface, every box, every roll of fabric, every tool purchased was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that would soon transform his modest home into the centerpiece of a battle between freedom and control. The HOA thrived on intimidation, but what they feared most was exposure. They operated quietly, hidden behind paperwork and bureaucratic jargon. If a resident challenged them, the board relied on secrecy and quiet compliance to win. But his plan was designed to make everything public, undeniable, and impossible to hide. The first step was research. He scoured the HOA bylaws late into the night, flipping page after page of the dense, lawyer-written handbook. Most of it was the usual nonsense: lawn maintenance requirements, noise restrictions, paint color approvals. But tucked inside were the key sections he was looking for. The rules specifically banned independent flagpoles and exterior flag displays not pre-approved by the board. But nowhere did it mention exterior art, murals, or decorative wraps applied to the structure of the home itself. That loophole was his golden ticket. If the HOA could hang seasonal banners at the clubhouse, if neighbors could commission giant Halloween displays that spilled onto their porches, then surely his house could be his canvas. The board had tried to outlaw one small flag, but they had left the door wide open for something far bigger. With the legal groundwork in place, he moved to logistics. Covering an entire house was no small task. He needed durable materials, weatherproof enough to withstand rain, wind, and sunlight. He also needed colors bold and vibrant enough to be seen from blocks away. That meant custom fabric, specialized paints, and industrial-size printing equipment. He reached out to suppliers discreetly, framing the project as a patriotic mural installation. Money trickled out of his savings account, but he treated every purchase as an investment in a larger victory. The second step was secrecy. He knew if the HOA got wind of what he was planning, they'd try to sabotage it before it ever saw the light of day. So, he staged deliveries at odd times, disguising boxes as standard renovation supplies. He coordinated with a small crew, trusted contractors who valued discretion and had no love for overbearing HOAs themselves. They swore to keep quiet, intrigued by the audacity of the idea. At night, he would walk around his house with a measuring tape, carefully noting each wall, window, and roof angle. He mapped everything out on sheets of graph paper, sketching how the massive design would drape over the structure. Every stripe, every star had to align perfectly. It wouldn't be enough for is to simply exist. It needed to be flawless, undeniable, and breathtaking. The third step was timing. The HOA board met on the first Monday of every month, which meant their attention would be scattered leading up to that date. He planned to start his project just after their meeting, giving him nearly a full month before the next round of inspections and potential complaints. That month would be enough to finish the transformation and present them with a fait accompli. Once it was up, once it was visible to the entire neighborhood, the battle would no longer be between him and a few board members. It would be between the HOA and everyone watching. The first pieces went up quietly, a roll of deep red fabric stretched across one wall late one evening, secured under the cover of darkness. By morning, it looked like nothing more than a tarp covering part of the siding, easily mistaken for construction work. The HOA's roving compliance patrol didn't think twice about it. The next night, a section of pure white fabric joined the red, covering another portion of the house. Then came the blue. Brilliant, striking, adorned with carefully placed stars. Each night, another piece was added, stitched together with precision, until the house began to transform. At first, only small hints of the larger design were visible, but as the days passed, the image became clearer. From a distance, it started to resemble something incredible. Not random colors, not construction coverings, but the unmistakable pattern of the American flag. Neighbors began to notice. Whispers spread along the sidewalks. Some stopped and stared as they walked their dogs, others slowed their cars as they drove past, unsure whether to be impressed or concerned. Children pointed and laughed with delight, tugging at their parents' arms to get a better look. For many, it was the boldest act of defiance they had ever seen against the HOA's suffocating rules. But the HOA itself remained in the dark, at least tea for the moment. Their patrols passed by casually, dismissing the work as routine renovation. The board members, confident in their own authority, had no idea they were about to be blindsided. Inside the house, the man barely slept. He worked through the nights, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of satisfaction. Every stroke of paint, every carefully placed strip of fabric was an act of rebellion, a declaration that he would not be silenced. The project consumed him, but in the best way possible. For once, he wasn't just surviving under the HOA's rule. He was fighting back. By the time 2 weeks had passed, the house was nearly complete. The muted beige siding was gone, replaced with bold red and white stripes stretching from the foundation to the roof. The upper facade and gables were covered in deep blue, dotted with brilliant white stars. At night, floodlights illuminated the mural, casting the entire display in a glow that could be seen from blocks away. The effect was staggering. What had once been a quiet, cookie-cutter house was now a massive, unapologetic symbol of defiance. The morning after the final section was completed, the neighborhood awoke to the full spectacle. It was no longer a secret, no longer something whispered about in passing. It was undeniable. The entire house had become a flag, towering over the street, impossible to ignore. Phones came out immediately. Neighbors snapped pictures, teenagers posted videos, and within hours, social media lit up with the story. The bold homeowner who had been told to take down his flag had responded by wrapping his entire house in one. And as those photos spread, the HOA's silence shattered. The board convened an emergency meeting. Letters began flying out to residents. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the once quiet neighborhood braced itself for the storm that was about to erupt. Because if the HOA thought they could control one man, they were about to learn what happened when he decided to fight back in a way the entire world could see. The morning the flag house was revealed in full, the neighborhood was buzzing. Cars slowed to a crawl as drivers gawked. Parents pointed it out to their children, and people walking dogs stopped mid-stride to take photos. What had once been just another home on a quiet suburban street had become a spectacle, an unmistakable, towering declaration that someone had dared to challenge the authority of the HOA. For many, it was inspiring. For others, it was intimidating. And for the HOA board members, it was nothing less than war. By mid-morning, a cluster of board members had gathered at the foot of the driveway, their arms crossed, their expressions tight with disapproval. They paced back and forth, snapping photos of their own, jotting down notes, and whispering in urgent tones. The man inside the house didn't step out to greet them. He didn't need to. His message was already written on every inch of his home, in stripes and stars too massive to ignore. That afternoon, the first letter arrived. Unlike the earlier polite notice, this one was aggressive, dripping with legal jargon and bold-faced threats. The board accused him of violating multiple sections of the association's code, citing terms like unsightly alteration, unauthorized decoration, and detrimental impact on community harmony. The letter warned of daily fines, escalating penalties, and even the possibility of legal action if the display wasn't removed immediately. But there was one problem for the HOA: the bylaws. Nowhere did they specifically forbid murals or exterior art. Nowhere did they prohibit wrapping one's house in decorative material, as long as it was safely installed and did not cause damage to neighboring properties. The man had checked every line, every clause, every footnote. The HOA had written a rule against flagpoles and standalone banners, but not against what he had done. He had beaten them at their own game, and they knew it. Still, that didn't stop the intimidation. The fines started small, just a few dollars a day. Then they doubled, and doubled again. Threatening letters arrived almost daily, each one more desperate than the last. Board members lingered on the street, scribbling in clipboards, taking pictures from every angle, trying to find a technicality they could weaponize. Neighbors began to take sides. Some rallied behind the homeowner, offering quiet words of encouragement or leaving supportive notes in his mailbox. Others, fearful of the HOA's wrath, distanced themselves, muttering about unnecessary trouble and making the neighborhood look bad. One neighbor, emboldened by the board, went so far as to file a formal complaint, claiming the massive flag was offensive and unpatriotic because it disrupted the uniformity of the community. But the louder the HOA became, the louder the public grew in response. Videos of the house continued to spread online, racking up thousands of views. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing residents and showing footage of the massive flag house towering over its quiet suburban street. Social media exploded with comments, some praising the homeowner for standing up to oppressive rules, others criticizing the HOA for overreaching their authority. The board's tactics escalated. They tried intimidation in person, sending members to knock on the door and demand compliance. When that failed, they turned to scare tactics, hinting at lawsuits, liens, and foreclosure. They printed flyers, warning other residents that if this display was allowed to stand, chaos would follow. Soon, they claimed, the neighborhood would be filled with giant political statements, unsightly graffiti, and declining property values. But the more they tried to paint the display as harmful, the more ridiculous they sounded. After all, the house wasn't covered in graffiti or slogans. It was wrapped in a clean, meticulously designed American flag. To many, it symbolized not chaos, but freedom. It was a reminder that beneath the HOA's rules and regulations, people still had a voice. The tension spilled into the monthly board meeting. The clubhouse, usually half empty during routine gatherings, was packed wall to wall. Residents who rarely spoke up came to witness the showdown. On one side sat the board, stiff and defensive. On the other, homeowners murmured with restless energy, waiting to see what would happen next. The board presented their case with rehearsed precision, flashing slides of the bylaws, listing supposed violations, and warning of doom if the display continued. But when they opened the floor for comments, something unexpected happened. One by one, residents began voicing support for the homeowner. Some spoke of pride, others of principle, and many simply of exhaustion with the HOA's endless micromanagement. For years, they had endured the board's heavy hand in silence. They had repainted fences, cut down trees, and changed holiday decorations just to comply with arbitrary rules. But now, finally, someone had stood up and shown it was possible to push back and win. The flag house was more than a display. It was a rallying point. By the end of the meeting, the board was shaken. They had expected compliance or at least quiet submission. Instead, they were facing a growing wave of resistance. The letters and fines continued, but it was clear their grip on the community was slipping. Inside the flag house, the man stayed calm. He didn't rant, didn't argue, didn't cave. He let the board exhaust themselves with threats while he simply maintained his display, confident in the loophole that protected him. Each night, the floodlights illuminated the flag even brighter, turning his home into a beacon against the HOA's darkness. The battle lines had been drawn, this was far from over. The HOA wasn't ready to admit defeat, not when their authority was being publicly challenged. And as the story spread beyond the neighborhood, attracting even more attention, the stakes continued to rise. The man had set out to make a point, but now his fight was no longer just about a flag. It was about freedom, control, and the right to stand up to those who demanded obedience at any cost. And the HOA? They were preparing their next move, one that would push this conflict into uncharted territory. The weeks that followed marked a turning point in the battle. The HOA, embarrassed by the overwhelming attention and rattled by the pushback from residents, abandoned subtlety altogether. Their war was no longer being fought with quiet letters and polite warnings. It was being waged with lawyers, smear tactics, and a relentless campaign to paint the homeowner as a reckless troublemaker. The first strike came in the form of a thick envelope, hand-delivered by a man in a suit. It was a formal notice of intent to sue, citing damages to the reputation and harmony of the community. The HOA claimed the massive flag display was lowering property values, frightening potential buyers, and driving away prospective residents. The language was exaggerated to the point of absurdity, but it was backed by the association's legal team, who threatened years of litigation and tens of thousands of dollars in fines. Most people would have folded under the pressure, quietly taking down the display rather than risk financial ruin. But the homeowner had anticipated this move. He immediately consulted his own attorney, who combed through the documents with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. The HOA's claims were flimsy at best. No evidence supported their assertion of declining property values, and their bylaws remained silent on murals or exterior art. The case, if sued, would likely collapse in court. Still, the threat was real. The HOA's power wasn't rooted in fairness or logic. It was in its ability to exhaust, intimidate, and outspend. Dragging the homeowner into endless legal battles could cripple him financially, even if he ultimately won. And that was exactly what the board was counting on. But something had shifted since the unveiling of the flag house. The homeowner wasn't fighting alone anymore. The story had gone national. News stations sent crews to film the house, broadcasting it across the country. Talk shows debated the meaning of the display, while opinion pieces framed it as a classic battle of individual freedom versus bureaucratic control. Online, the house became a viral sensation, shared across countless platforms with hashtags demanding justice for the homeowner. And with that attention came allies. Veterans groups publicly expressed their support, praising the homeowner for defending the flag's place in American life. Civil liberties organizations weighed in, calling the HOA's actions unconstitutional overreach. Even local businesses offered to donate supplies, legal aid, and financial assistance, eager to be associated with the fight. What had started as one man's personal stand was rapidly becoming a cause much bigger than himself. The HOA scrambled to regain control of the narrative. They issued press releases, insisting their actions had nothing to do with the flag itself, but were instead about maintaining neighborhood standards. They claimed the homeowner was manipulating the media, turning a simple dispute into a spectacle. But every attempt they made only drew more ridicule. To the public, their excuses sounded hollow. To residents, it confirmed what they already knew, that the board's obsession with control had blinded them to reason. Meanwhile, the pressure within the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Some residents, emboldened by the support pouring in, began quietly defying other HOA rules. A garden gnome appeared in one yard, a brightly painted mailbox in another. For years, people had feared the board's wrath. Now, they were testing its limits. The once uniform rows of beige and gray were starting to crack, revealing sparks of individuality the HOA could no longer easily suppress. But the board didn't back down. Instead, they escalated with harassment. Anonymous complaints piled up against the homeowner. False reports of noise violations, accusations of unkempt lawns, even claims of improper trash disposal. Inspectors showed up unannounced, prowling his property with cameras and clipboards, searching for any minor infraction to use as leverage. At night, board members huddled together in tense meetings, their voices rising as they debated their options. They were losing control of the community, losing face in the media, and worst of all, losing the fear they had cultivated for so long. If the flag house wasn't crushed, their authority would never recover. Inside the home, the man carried on calmly, almost defiantly. He continued to maintain the display, patching any weather damage, keeping the lights shining bright each night. But behind his composure, he understood the stakes had risen. This was no longer a local feud. It was a national battle being waged in the spotlight. As the legal threats mounted, supporters began organizing rallies. One weekend, a crowd gathered outside the neighborhood, waving flags of their own and chanting in support of the homeowner. Cars honked as they drove past, cheering and shouting encouragement. The scene was peaceful, but its message was unmistakable. He was not standing alone anymore. The HOA, infuriated, called in law enforcement, hoping to shut the demonstrations down. But the police, after reviewing the situation, found no violations. The protest was legal, the crowd respectful. The board's complaints were dismissed. Once again, their attempt to silence the opposition had backfired spectacularly. By now, the neighborhood was fractured. Those siding with the HOA huddled nervously, whispering about the chaos and wishing for things to return to normal. Those siding with the homeowner walked taller, emboldened by the growing momentum. And in between stood the silent majority, watching closely as the battle played out, waiting to see which side would emerge victorious. As summer wore on, the fight only grew more intense. National outlets continued covering the story, while online commentators dissected every move the HOA made. Donations poured in for the homeowner's legal defense, enough to ensure he wouldn't be bankrupted by the board's lawsuits. Every time the HOA tried to tighten the screws, they found themselves facing greater resistance than before. But behind their desperation lurked a dangerous resolve. The HOA board wasn't simply trying to win a case anymore. They were fighting for their survival. Their authority, their reputation, and their control over the neighborhood were slipping through their fingers. And as their grip weakened, their tactics grew more reckless. The man knew the worst was yet to come. The board would not go quietly. They would launch their most aggressive assault yet, one that could either end the battle in their favor or destroy them completely. The question wasn't whether the fight would escalate further, it was how far the HOA was willing to go to cling to their power. And the answer was coming soon. By the time autumn rolled in, the neighborhood no longer felt like the orderly enclave it once had been. What had once been a place defined by manicured lawns and carefully measured conformity was now the stage of an ongoing battle watched by millions. The flag house stood boldly at the center, lit at night by powerful floodlights, its colors bright against the dark sky. Every passerby knew its story. Every resident lived under its shadow. The HOA, humiliated by months of public scorn, decided it was time to deliver their decisive strike. They had tried letters, fines, threats, smear campaigns, and harassment, but none of it had broken the homeowner. So, they turned to their most extreme weapon, the courts. One morning, a sheriff's deputy arrived with a thick stack of paperwork. The board had filed an official lawsuit in county court, accusing the homeowner of willful noncompliance, damaging the community's reputation, and causing measurable property devaluation. They demanded the immediate removal of the display, repayment of mounting fines, and coverage of the HOA's legal fees. To the board, this was their checkmate. They believed that, no matter how flimsy their case, the sheer weight of legal fees and the grind of court procedures would break their opponent. Most homeowners, when faced with the terrifying prospect of litigation, backed down long before reaching trial. That was the HOA's way. They didn't need to be right, only relentless. But this time, they had underestimated their enemy. The homeowner's attorney filed a fiery counter-response, dismantling the HOA's claims point by point. Not only was there no clause banning exterior murals, but the accusations of property value loss were baseless speculation. Even worse for the board, their own meeting minutes, now obtained as public records, revealed how casually they had ignored other decorations in the neighborhood while singling him out. It wasn't enforcement of standards. It was selective targeting. When news of the lawsuit broke, the story exploded once again across the media. Headlines framed it as a David versus Goliath battle, a single man standing against the crushing machinery of a homeowners association. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood, interviewing residents as they came and went. Supporters rallied again, this time larger and louder than before, with flags lining the streets leading into the community. The board doubled down. They printed newsletters attacking the homeowner, painting him as selfish, reckless, and dangerous to the community's future. They urged residents to rally behind them, warning that if his lawlessness went unchecked, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. A few loyalists clapped along, but most residents remained quiet or openly skeptical. After all, they could see the house with their own eyes. They knew the truth didn't match the board's narrative. Behind closed doors, the board's meetings grew frantic. Arguments broke out among members. Some wanted to settle quietly, recognizing that the HOA was losing ground. Others, more stubborn and prideful, insisted they had to crush the homeowner at any cost, or else risk losing their authority entirely. Their debates grew heated, their unity fractured, but outwardly they maintained the facade of strength. As court dates loomed, the homeowner prepared in silence. He wasn't the type to seek attention, but he had learned to endure it. Every letter, every threat, every headline had only steeled his resolve. The house, covered in red, white, and blue, had become more than a display of patriotism. It was a symbol of resistance to arbitrary control, a living reminder of what one person could do when pushed too far. Meanwhile, residents continued to test the boundaries. Holiday decorations went up earlier and grew bolder. Yards sprouted colorful flowers not on the HOA's approved list. A resident painted his shutters a shade darker than the standard palette, daring the board to object. What had once been unthinkable was now becoming normal. Quiet rebellion was spreading, and the HOA's power was slipping through their fingers like sand. When the first court hearing finally arrived, the board expected the homeowner to look rattled. Instead, he walked in calm, steady, accompanied by his lawyer and a small crowd of supporters carrying mini HOA flags. The courtroom buzzed with reporters and onlookers, their cameras flashing, their pens scratching across notepads. The board's attorney laid out their case with stern confidence, citing supposed damages and violations. But their argument crumbled under scrutiny. When pressed for evidence of property value decline, they admitted no appraisals had been conducted. When asked why other decorations had not been penalized, they dodged the question. When confronted with their own bylaws, the loophole was undeniable. The homeowner's lawyer countered with precision, presenting photographs, records, and even testimonials from neighbors who praised the display. Each point dismantled the HOA's claims until their case looked less like enforcement and more like persecution. By the time the hearing ended, the board's faces were pale, their confidence shaken. The judge did not deliver an immediate ruling, but the tone of the proceedings was clear. The HOA's once unassailable authority had been dragged into the open, exposed for its pettiness and hypocrisy. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning. Back in the neighborhood, residents gathered in small groups, buzzing with what they had heard. For years they had whispered complaints about the HOA behind closed doors, afraid of retribution. Now, for the first time, they began to openly question the board's legitimacy. Support for the homeowner swelled, and even those who had stayed neutral began to see him not as a troublemaker, but as a man standing up for everyone's right to live free from tyranny. The HOA, cornered and desperate, began plotting in secret. They whispered about emergency amendments, special assessments, and even attempts to recall the homeowners' voting rights within the association. But every move they considered came with risks, and with the eyes of the nation watching, even the smallest misstep would be catastrophic. The battle had reached its peak, and both sides knew the final clash was approaching. The homeowner was determined not just to defend himself, but to secure a victory so decisive the HOA could never repeat its abuse of power again. The board, unwilling to admit defeat, was preparing its most ruthless counterattack. And in the shadows of the neighborhood, with the flag house glowing brightly under the autumn sky, the community braced itself for the climax of the fight, one that would either topple the HOA's authority once and for all, or drag the entire neighborhood into chaos. The neighborhood awoke to a heavy silence in the days following the first court hearing. Everyone sensed that something was about to happen, though no one could predict what form it would take. The HOA board had been humiliated in front of a judge, their arguments dismantled piece by piece, yet their pride and desperation refused to let them concede. Behind the closed doors of their meetings, they plotted furiously, determined to deliver one final blow that would reassert their control. Their move came suddenly. On a crisp October morning, residents found envelopes taped to their doors. Inside each one was a letter from the HOA announcing a special emergency assessment. The explanation was vague, but the effect was clear. Every household in the neighborhood would be required to pay a hefty fee to cover legal expenses incurred in protecting community standards. It was a thinly veiled attempt to shift the cost of their war against the flag house onto the very residents who had grown weary of the fight. The backlash was immediate. Homeowners stormed out of their houses, clutching the letters in disbelief and anger. For many, this was the breaking point. It was one thing to endure nitpicking over fences and flower beds, but being forced to pay for a vendetta that had already embarrassed the community was intolerable. The anger that had simmered quietly for months now boiled over into open rebellion. The homeowner, watching from his porch, understood that the board had just sealed its own fate. What had begun as a personal fight was now a community uprising. Neighbors who had once kept their distance came to his door, waving their letters and demanding to know what could be done. For the first time, they weren't afraid of the board's retribution. They were furious enough to confront it head-on. Word spread quickly, and within days, residents organized an emergency petition to recall the board. Signatures poured in faster than anyone anticipated. People who had been silent for years eagerly added their names, hungry for change. The board, once so confident in its stranglehold, was suddenly on the defensive. The breaking point came at the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse overflowed with residents, their voices echoing with anger and determination. The board tried to maintain control, pounding their gavels and threatening to adjourn, but it was useless. One by one, residents stood up and demanded answers. Why were they wasting money on lawsuits? Why were they targeting one man while ignoring bigger issues? Why were they punishing the entire neighborhood for their personal vendetta? The board had no convincing answers. Their justifications, once delivered with icy authority, now sounded hollow and defensive. The residents had tasted defiance, and they weren't about to swallow excuses anymore. When the petition was presented, with more than enough signatures to trigger a recall, the room erupted. The board members exchanged nervous glances, their grip on power visibly slipping away. Within weeks, a vote was held. The outcome wasn't even close. The board was dissolved, its members removed from power by the very people they had ruled over for so long. A new committee was elected, one built on transparency, fairness, and the promise of restoring balance to the neighborhood. For the first time in years, residents felt like they had a voice again. As for the lawsuit, it collapsed soon after. Without the board's backing, the case was abandoned, dismissed quietly by the courts. The homeowner was free, his display untouched, his defiance vindicated. The flag house remained exactly as it was, bold, brilliant, and unmissable. But the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to the entire community. In tearing down the board's authority, the residents had reclaimed their independence. Rules were rewritten to be reasonable and respectful. Petty fines and invasive inspections disappeared. The fear that had once hung over every decision, what color to paint, what flowers to plant, what decorations to hang, was gone. The house itself became a landmark. People drove from neighboring towns just to see it, snapping photos and posting them online. Local schools brought students on field trips to learn about the story of one man standing against unfair authority. Veterans saluted as they passed by. Tourists stopped to marvel at the bold stripes and brilliant stars stretched across the siding. What had begun as a fight against suppression had become a symbol of resilience. And through it all, the homeowner never boasted. He didn't gloat over the board's downfall or claim himself a hero. He continued to mow his lawn, maintain his property, and quietly take care of his family. But every night, as the floodlights illuminated the massive flag that covered his home, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had been pushed, cornered, and threatened, yet he had never given in. And in the end, it wasn't just his victory. It was everyone's. The lesson spread beyond the neighborhood. Articles and news segments reflected on the story as an example of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be silenced. Commentators pointed out how quickly power can crumble when it's abused, and how one small act of defiance can ignite a movement larger than anyone ever expected. The HOA had ban, Ned his flag, hoping to make him small and compliant. Instead, they had unleashed a storm that consumed them entirely. His response, wrapping his house in the very symbol they tried to suppress, had not only exposed their hypocrisy, but had toppled their authority altogether. In the end, the neighborhood changed forever. The houses still stood in their neat rows, the lawns still grew green and well-kept, but the spirit was different. Residents felt freer, lighter, more willing to express themselves. And at the center of it all, the flag house stood as a permanent reminder. No matter how powerful the rules may seem, no matter how intimidating the enforcers, one person's courage can turn the tide. And so, as the sun set behind the neighborhood, casting a warm glow across the red, white, and blue siding of the house, it was clear that this story was more than just about an HOA dispute. It was about freedom, resilience, and the undeniable truth that when you stand up to unjust authority, you don't just protect yourself, you inspire everyone around you to do the same. The battle was over. The flag house remained, and the HOA was nothing more than a memory.